Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the dramatic and frankly tragic rise and fall of one of the absolute greatest military minds in Philippine history. We're talking about General Antonio Luna. This is a man whose revolutionary reforms took a really loosely organized militia and forged them into a disciplined army, one that was actually capable of standing toe-to-toe with a global superpower. But, as you're going to see, his fiercest battles weren't just fought on the front lines against foreign enemies. I mean, it's the ultimate irony, right? How does a brilliant general, a guy who successfully engineered a massive defense to hold off an invading American army, end up being ambushed by his own countrymen? It's a staggering contradiction, and honestly, it remains one of the most intensely debated events in the history of the Philippines. So we are going to explore two very different sides of Antonio Luna today. On one hand, you have the architect, this visionary who demanded absolute discipline and a centralized command to build a truly professional military. But on the other hand, we have the martyr, the uncompromising leader whose brutal, deeply controversial end at the hands of fellow Filipinos cemented a completely tragic legacy. Act 1. Scientist turned strategist. Well, what's really fascinating here is that Luna wasn't originally a rebel. In fact, back when the Philippine Revolution first kicked off in 1896, he actually believed that peaceful reforms within the Spanish system were still possible. You see, he was an incredibly highly educated ilustrado. We're talking degrees in pharmacy from Manila and Spain, deep studies in chemistry, bacteriology, and military science in Belgium and France. He even wrote for a reformist newspaper under the pen name Taga Ilog. So his background was deeply rooted in science. And that meant when he finally did join the revolution, his approach to war was highly methodical. It was completely revolutionary for the local militia. And this brings us to his core philosophy, which was simple but pretty harsh. He essentially believed that soldiers must obey the chain of command, period, not their provincial loyalties. When the Spanish-American War erupted and President Emilio Aguinaldo appointed him Chief of War Operations, Luna took one look at the Filipino forces and realized a really hard truth. Patriotism is great, but patriotism alone wasn't going to cut it. He knew that traditional, disorganized regional fighting, where guys were basically only loyal to their local warlords, would be absolute suicide against a professional American army equipped with naval guns and Gatling guns. So he comes up with his absolute masterpiece, the Luna defense line. Knowing he couldn't just fight massive head-on battles in the open, he engineered the sophisticated, multi-layered trench system across the flat plains of central Luzon. It was like a giant, staggered puzzle. He utilized the natural choke points of rivers and swamps, constructed these deeply layered trenches fortified with bamboo obstacles, and the ultimate goal? Bleed the enemy for every single mile they advanced northward. It wasn't actually designed to stop the Americans completely, but rather to strategically delay and exhaust them. He was buying precious time for the Republic to establish a secure guerrilla base up in the mountains. But, to execute a strategy that complex, you need a real army. So Luna single-handedly built a professional force from the ground up, all based on strict European doctrine. He brought in standardized drills, set up proper supply systems, and even founded the first military academy of the Philippine Republic in Malolos, just to train competent officers. He also created the elite Luna sharpshooters, these carefully selected marksmen who quickly became one of the most feared units in the entire war. Oh, and he established the Black Guard as his personal security force and elite shock troops. The guy demanded absolute obedience and prized merit way above just blind bravery. Act 2. The Costs of Discipline. Now, as you can probably guess, introducing that level of strict European-style discipline into a militia of fiercely independent regional fighters came at a massive and ultimately fatal cost. Luna firmly believed that internal indiscipline was actually a bigger threat than the Americans. To stamp it out, he enforced Article 1, or Articulo Uno. This was a brutal military decree. He declared that anyone who refused orders, abandoned their post, or actually even just showed incompetence would be executed without trial. Harsh, right? Well, this doctrine did forge a semblance of a regular army, but it simultaneously planted the seeds of his own destruction. By arresting officers and disarming units, he deeply alienated the exact soldiers he needed, guys who were used to operating basically like independent warlords. Predictably, this created a really severe, dangerous divide within the Republic. On one side, he cultivated this fiercely loyal inner circle. You had officers like Colonel Francisco Paco Roman, a wealthy businessman who gave up his privilege to be Luna's right-hand man, Captain Eduardo Rusca, and General Jose Torres Bugayon. In fact, during the Battle of Caloocan, when Bugayon was mortally wounded, Luna literally charged straight into the line of fire to rescue him, weeping openly as he promoted him right there on his deathbed. But on the flip side, his list of enemies was growing exponentially. He alienated influential politicians like Pedro Paterno and Felipe Camino, openly calling them traitors for even considering a peace treaty that surrendered independence. And crucially, he deeply, deeply angered key military units. The absolute breaking point was with the Kawit Battalion. This specific unit served as President Aguinaldo's personal presidential guard from Cavite. During a really critical moment in battle, they flat out refused to obey Luna's orders, telling him they'd only take orders directly from the president. So what does Luna do? He publicly disarms and humiliates the entire battalion. Talk about foreshadowing. This act created bitter, lifelong enemies who felt loyal only to their regional leader, completely rejecting Luna's centralized chain of command. Act 3, The Trap at Cabanatuan. Okay, so the tension finally hits a boiling point in the bloody events of June 1899. Let's trace this minute by minute. On June 4th, Luna gets a telegram, supposedly from President Aguinaldo, ordering him to Cabanatuan to form a new cabinet. Believing the Republic desperately needed unified leadership, he immediately heads out. By the afternoon of June 5th, he arrives at the parish convent. But because a bridge had collapsed along the way, his main escort was delayed, so he arrives with just a tiny crew, Colonel Roman, Captain Ruska, and a few cavalrymen. He walks inside, fully expecting to see the president. Instead, he finds out Aguinaldo has left for Tarlac, and waiting for him in the office is his fierce political rival, Filippo Buencamino, along with members of that exact Kawit battalion he had humiliated earlier, including a Captain Pedro Genelino. A massive argument breaks out. Suddenly, a gunshot rings out outside. Luna furiously storms out to the stairs, and the ambush begins. The Kawit soldiers swarm him. He's shot in the head and then repeatedly hacked with bolos, heavy machetes. But even then, furious and fighting to the absolute bitter end, Luna forces his way out of the convent and into the plaza. He's firing his revolver, bleeding everywhere, and screaming his famous last words at his attackers. Cowards! Assassins! Before he finally collapses. 30. He suffered more than 30 fatal wounds from bullets and machetes. Just let that sink in. That number is a staggering, brutal testament to the intense, deeply personal hatred his assassins harbored against him. And you know, this tragedy didn't just claim Luna. It absolutely devastated his inner circle. Hearing all the commotion, his closest friend, Colonel Paco Roman, rushed out into the street to try and save his general, but he was instantly gunned down. Captain Eduardo Rusca tried to help too. He was severely shot in the leg, but miraculously managed to crawl into a nearby church and actually survived. This ambush basically wiped out the very loyalists who believed so deeply in Luna's vision for a unified republic. Act 4, A Tragic Legacy. Following his burial with full military honors the very next day, the aftermath of his death immediately sparked a historical debate that is still burning brightly today. We have to look at the debated role of President Emilio Aguinaldo impartially here. Now, the established facts are highly suspicious. Aguinaldo summoned Luna to Cabanatuan. He was conveniently absent when Luna arrived. No real investigation was ever launched. The assassins were never prosecuted. And shortly after, many of Luna's loyal officers were relieved of their commands. However, historians are quick to caution that absolute definitive documentary proof that Aguinaldo personally ordered the assassination just doesn't exist. So while some argue the circumstances heavily point to tacit responsibility or negligence, the lack of a paper trail means the exact extent of the president's involvement remains one of the greatest unresolved debates in Philippine history. He was only 32 years old. At just 32, Antonio Luna's life was violently cut short. But the true casualty of that day in Cabanatuan was the Philippine military itself, because his death instantly snapped the backbone of the regular army. And here is the bitter irony of it all. Without Luna's brilliant, centralized defensive strategy and his unyielding discipline, the conventional resistance against the Americans completely collapsed within months. His death disorganized the army, scattering the Filipino forces into the mountains. They were forced into the exact decentralized, prolonged, and grueling guerrilla war that Luna had been trying so desperately to strategically prepare them for with his defense lines. So as we reflect on his uncompromising discipline, his absolutely brilliant tactical mind, and his tragic assassination at the hands of his own men, we are left with a really tough question. Did the internal fight to create a unified professional army ultimately destroy its most brilliant architect? Could his demanding nature have been the very thing that doomed the Republic's best chance at a conventional defense? It's a complex, painful question, and one that ensures General Antonio Luna will forever be remembered as both the architect and the martyr of the Philippine Army.